You like headphones?
I don't think so.
You don't like headphones?
I don't know. Do I need them?
No, you
It
don't need
just
them.
kind of blocks out what's going on around you, and then makes you able to like hear
Okay,
your
yeah,
own
maybe
voice
headphones.
more.
Here you go.
I don't know if they're not going to work with my
Oh, you
hat.
can put them up with your hat, yeah. Don't keep it pointing. I did the same thing. I didn't move the hat.
All right.
Can you hear yourself?
Start at the
I can hear myself. All right.
Then let us know if you need anything.
Will do.
We'll be right here.
Okay. Racial segregation. Although the parallels listed above should be enough to give anyone pause, there are a number of other, less obvious similarities between mass incarceration and Jim Crow that have not been explored in earlier chapters. The creation and maintenance of racial segregation is one example. As we know, Jim Crow laws mandated residential segregation, and blacks were relegated to the worst parts of town. Roads literally stopped at the border of many black neighborhoods, shifting from pavement to dirt. Water, sewer systems, and other public services that supported the white areas of town frequently did not extend to the black areas. The extreme poverty that plagued blacks due to their legally sanctioned inferior status was largely invisible to whites. So long as whites remained in their own neighborhoods, which they were inclined to do. Racial segregation rendered black experience largely invisible to whites, making it easier for whites to maintain racial stereotypes about black values and culture. It also made it easier to deny or ignore their suffering. Mass incarceration functions similarly. It achieves racial segregation by segregating people in prison, the majority of whom are black and brown, from mainstream society. They are kept behind bars, typically more than 100 miles from home. Even prisons, the actual buildings, are a rare sight for many Americans, as they are often located far from population centers. Although rural counties contain only 20% of the U.S. population, 60% of new prison construction occurs there. Incarcerated people are thus hidden from public view, out of sight, out of mind. In a sense, imprisonment is a far more extreme form of physical and residential segregation than Jim Crow segregation. Rather than merely shunting black people to the other side of town or corralling them in ghettos, mass incarceration locks them in cages. Bars and walls keep hundreds of thousands of black and brown people away from mainstream society, a form of apartheid unlike any the world has ever seen. Prisons, however, are not the only vehicle for racial segregation. Segregation is also created and perpetrated by the flood of people who return to ghetto communities from prisons each year. Because the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, when people convicted of drug crimes are released, they are generally returned to racially segregated ghetto communities, the places they call home. In many cities, the reentry phenomenon is highly concentrated in a small number of neighborhoods. According to one study, during a 12-year period, the number of people returning from prison back home to core counties, those counties that contain the inner city of a metropolitan area, tripled. The effects are felt throughout the United States. In interviews with 100 residents of 2 Tallahassee, Florida communities, researchers found that nearly every one of them had experienced or expected to experience the return of a family member from prison. Similarly, a survey of families living in the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago found that the majority of residents either had a family member in prison or expected one to return from prison within the next 2 years. Fully 70% of men, can't look up, I lose my spot, 70% of men between the ages of 18 and 45 in the impoverished and overwhelmingly black North Lawndale neighborhood in Chicago's West Side are saddled for life with a criminal record. 70%. That's outrageous. The majority, 60%, were incarcerated for drug offenses. These neighborhoods are a minefield for people on parole, for a standard condition of parole is a promise not to associate with anyone who has a felony conviction. As Paula Wolf, a senior executive at Chicago Metropolis 2020 observes, in these ghetto neighborhoods, it is hard for a parolee to walk to the corner store and get a carton of milk without being subject to a parole violation. By contrast, whites, even poor whites, are far less likely to be in prison for drug offenses, and when they are released from prison, they rarely find themselves in the ghetto. The white poor have a vastly different experience in America than do poor people of color, as they are rarely relegated to a racially segregated urban areas characterized by Intense poverty. In New York City, one study found that 70% of the city's poor Black and Latino residents live in high-poverty neighborhoods, whereas 70% of the city's poor whites live in non-poverty neighborhoods, communities that have significant resources, including jobs, schools, banks, and grocery stores. Nationwide, nearly 7 out of 8 people living in high-poverty urban areas are members of a minority group. Mass incarceration thus perpetuates and deepens pre-existing patterns of racial segregation and isolation, not by just removing people of color from society and putting them in prisons, but by dumping them back into ghettos upon their release. Youth of color who might have escaped their ghetto communities or helped transform them if they had been given a fair shot in life and not been labeled felons, instead find themselves trapped in a closed circuit of perpetual marginality circulating between ghetto and prison. The racially segregated, poverty-stricken ghettos that exist in inner-city communities across America would not exist today but for racially biased government policies for which there has never been meaningful redress. Every year, hundreds of thousands of poor people of color or who have been targeted by the war on drugs are forced to return to those racially segregated communities, neighborhoods that are still crippled by the legacy of an early system of control. As a practical matter, they have no other choice. In this way, mass incarceration, like its predecessor Jim Crow, creates and maintains racial segregation. Symbolic production of race. Arguably, the most important parallel between mass incarceration and Jim Crow is that both have served to define the meaning and significance of race in America. Indeed, a primary function of any racial caste system is to define the meaning of race in its time. Slavery defined what it meant to be black, a slave. Jim Crow defined what it meant to be black, a second-class citizen. Today, mass incarceration defines the meaning of blackness in America. Black people, especially black men, are criminals. That is what it means to be black. The temptation is to insist that black men choose to be criminals. The system does not make them criminals, at least not in the way that slavery made blacks slaves or Jim Crow made them second-class citizens. The myth of choice here is seductive, but it should be resisted. African Americans are not significantly more likely to use or sell prohibited drugs than whites, but they are made criminals at drastically higher rates for precisely the same conduct. In fact, studies suggest that white professionals may be the most likely group of any group to have engaged in illegal drug activity in their lifetime, yet they are the least likely to be made criminals. The prevalence of illegal drug activity among racial and ethnic groups create a situation in which, due to limited law enforcement resources and political constraints, some people are made criminals while others are not. Black people have been made criminals by the war on drugs to a degree that dwarfs its effect on any other racial and ethnic groups, especially whites. And the process of making them criminals has produced a racial stigma. Every racial caste system in the United States has produced racial stigma. Mass incarceration is no exception. Racial stigma is produced by defining negatively what it means to be black. The stigma of race was once the shame of the slave. Then it was the shame of the second-class citizen. Today, the stigma of race is the shame of the criminal. As described in Chapter 4, many people labeled criminals describe an existential angst associated with their pariah status, an angst that casts a shadow on every aspect of their identity and social experience. The shame and stigma are not limited to the individual. They extend to family members and friends. Even whole communities are stigmatized by the presence of those caught and thus tainted by the system. Those stigmatized by convictions often adopt coping strategies African Americans once employed during the Jim Crow era, including lying about their own criminal history or the status of their family members in an attempt to pass as someone who would be welcomed by mainstream society. The critical point here is that for black men, the stigma of being a criminal in the area of mass incarceration is fundamentally a racial stigma. That is not to say stigma is absent for white people convicted of crimes. It is present and powerful. Rather, the point is that the stigma of criminality for whites is different. It's a non-racial stigma. An experiment may help to illustrate how and why this is the case. Say the following to nearly anyone and watch the reaction. We really need to do something about the problem of white crime. Laughter is likely response. The term white crime is nonsensical in the era of mass incarceration unless one is referring to white-collar crime, in which case the term is understood to mean types of crimes that seemingly respectable white people commit in the comfort of fancy offices. Because the term white crime lacks social meaning, the term white criminal is also perplexing. In that formulation, white seems to qualify the term criminal as if to say he is a criminal, but not that kind of criminal. Or he's not a real criminal, i.e., not what we mean by criminal today. In the era of mass incarceration, what it means to be a criminal in our collective consciousness has become conflated with what it means to be black, so the term white criminal is confounding, while the term black criminal is nearly redundant. Recall the study discussed in Chapter 3 that revealed that when survey respondents were asked to picture a drug criminal, nearly everyone pictured someone who was black. This phenomenon helps to explain why studies indicate that white people with a criminal record may actually have an easier time gaining employment than African Americans without a criminal record. To be a black man is to be thought of as a criminal, and to be a black criminal is to be despicable, a social pariah. To be a white criminal is not easy by any means, but as a white criminal you are not a racial outcast, though you may face many forms of social and economic exclusion. Whiteness mitigates crime, whereas blackness defines a criminal. As we have seen in earlier chapters, the conflation of blackness with crime did not happen organically. Rather, it was constructed by political and media elites as part of the broad project known as the War on Drugs. This conflation served to provide a legitimate outlet to the expression of anti-black resentment and animus, a convenient release valve now that explicit forms of racial bias are strictly condemned. In the era of colorblindness, it's no longer permissible to hate blacks, but we can hate criminals. Indeed, we are encouraged to do so. As writer John Edgar Wideman points out, it is respectable to tar and feather criminals, to advocate locking them up and throwing away the key. It's not racist to be against crime, even though the archetypal criminal in the media and public imagination almost always wears Willie Horton's face. It is precisely because our criminal justice system provides a vehicle for the expression of conscious and unconscious anti-black sentiment that the prison label is experienced as racial stigma. The stigma exists whether or not one has been formally branded a criminal, yet another parallel to Jim Crow. Just as African Americans in the North were stigmatized by the Jim Crow system, even if they were not subject to its formal control, black men today are stigmatized by mass incarceration and the social construct of the criminal black man, whether they have ever been to prison or not. For those who have been branded, the branding serves to intensify and deepen the racial stigma, as they are consciously reminded in virtually every contact they have with public agencies, as well as with private employers and landlords, that they are the new untouchables. In this way, the stigma of race has become the stigma of criminality. Throughout the criminal justice system, as well as in our schools and public spaces, young plus black plus male is equated with reasonable suspicion, justifying the arrest, interrogation, search, and detention of thousands of African Americans every year, as well as their exclusion from employment and housing and the denial of educational opportunity. Because black youth are viewed as criminals, they face severe employment discrimination and are also pushed out of schools through racially biased school discipline policies. For black youth, the experience of being made black often begins with the first police stop, interrogation, search, or arrest. The experience carries social meaning. This is what it means to be black. The story of one's first time may be repeated to family or friends, but for ghetto youth, almost no one imagines that the first time will be the last. The experience is understood to define the terms of one's relationship not only to the state, but to society at large. This reality can be frustrating for those who strive to help ghetto youth turn their lives around. James Foreman Jr., the co-founder of the See Forever Charter School for juveniles arrested or convicted in Washington, D.C., made this point when describing how random and degrading stops and searches of ghetto youth tell kids that they are pariahs, that no matter how hard they study, they will remain potential suspects. One student complained to him, "We can be perfect, doing everything right, and they still treat us like dogs. No, worse than dogs, because criminals are treated worse than dogs." Another student asked him pointedly, "How can you tell us we can be anything when they treat us like we're nothing?" The process of... I'm going to highlight that. The process of marking black youth as black criminals is essential to the functioning of mass incarceration as a racial caste system. For the system to succeed, that is, for it to achieve the political goals described in Chapter 1, black people must be labeled criminals before they are formally subject to control. The black label is essential, for forms of explicit racial exclusion are not only prohibited, but widely condemned. Thus, black youth must be made, labeled, criminals. This process of being made a criminal is, to a large extent, the process of becoming black. As Weidman explains, when to be a man of color of a certain economic class and milieu is equivalent to the public eye in the public eye to being a criminal. Being processed by the criminal justice system is tantamount to being made black, and doing time behind bars is at the same time marking race. At its core, then, mass incarceration, like Jim Crow, is a race-making institution. It serves to define the meaning and significance of race in America. The limits of the analogy. Saying that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow can leave a misimpression. The parallels between the two systems of control are striking, to say the least. In both, we find racial opportunism by politicians, legalized discrimination, political disenfranchisement, exclusion of blacks from juries, stigmatization, and the closing of courthouse doors, racial segregation, and the symbolic production of race. Yet there are important differences. Just as Jim Crow, as a system of racial control, was dramatically different from slavery, mass incarceration is different from its predecessor. In fact, if one were to draft a list of differences between slavery and Jim Crow, the list might well be longer than the list of similarities. The same goes for Jim Crow and mass incarceration. Each system of control has been unique, well adapted to the circumstances of its time. If we fail to appreciate the differences, we will be hindered in our ability to meet the challenges created by the current moment. At the same time, though, we must carefully not assume... Highlighting. Let's go back. Each system of control has been unique, well adapted to the circumstances of its time. If we fail to appreciate the differences, we will be hindered in our ability to meet the challenges created by the current moment. I think that's really important, and one thing that we've all talked about is that you can't be stuck in a time with your mind. You have to adjust to the new times. At the same time, though, we must be careful not to assume that differences exist when they do not, or to exaggerate the ones that do. Some differences may appear on the surface to be major, but on close analysis, they prove less significant. An example of a difference that is less significant than it may initially appear is the fact that Jim Crow was explicitly race-based, whereas mass incarceration is not. This statement initially appears self-evident, but it is partially mistaken. Although it is common to think of Jim Crow as an explicitly race-based system, in fact, a number of the key policies were officially colorblind. As previously noted, poll taxes, literacy tests, and felon disenfranchisement laws were all formally race-neutral practices that were employed in order to avoid the prohibition on race discrimination in voting contained in the 15th Amendment. These laws operated to create an all-white electorate because they excluded African Americans from the franchise, but were not generally applied to whites. Poll workers had the discretion to charge a poll tax or administer a literacy test or not. and they exercised their discretion in a racially discriminatory manner. Laws that said nothing about race operated to discriminate, because those charged with enforcement were granted tremendous discretion, and they exercised that discretion in a highly discriminatory manner. The same is true in the drug war. Laws prohibiting the use and sale of drugs are facially race neutral, but they are enforced in a highly discriminatory fashion. The decision to wage the drug war primarily in black and brown communities rather than white ones, and to target African Americans but not whites on freeways and train stations, has had precisely the same effect as the literacy and poll taxes of the earlier era. A facially race-neutral system of laws has operated to create a racial caste system. Other differences between Jim Crow and mass incarceration are actually more significant than they might initially appear. An example relates to the role of racial stigma in our society. As discussed in Chapter 4, during Jim Crow, racial stigma contributed to racial solidarity in the black community. Racial stigma today, however, that is, the stigma of black criminality, has turned the black community against itself, destroyed networks of mutual support, and created a silence around the new caste system among many of the people most affected by it. The implications of this difference are profound. Racial stigma today makes collective action extremely difficult, sometimes impossible, whereas racial stigma during Jim Crow contained the seeds of revolt. Described below are a number of the other important differences between Jim Crow and mass incarceration. Listing all the differences here is impractical, so instead we will focus on the few major differences that are most frequently cited in defense of mass incarceration, including the absence of overt racial hostility, the inclusion of whites in the system of control, and the African American support for some get-tough policies on drug war tactics. First one, absence of racial hostility. First, let's consider the absence of overt racial hostility among politicians who support harsh drug laws and the law enforcement officials charged with enforcing them. The absence of overt racial hostility is a significant difference from Jim Crow, but it can be exaggerated. Mass incarceration, like Jim Crow, was born of racial opportunism, an effort by white elites to exploit the racial hostilities, resentments, and insecurities of poor and working-class whites. Moreover, racial hostility and racial violence have not altogether disappeared, given that complaints of racial slurs and brutality by the police and prison guards are fairly common. Some scholars and commentators have pointed out that the racial violence once associated with brutal slave masters or the Ku Klux Klan has been replaced, to some extent, by violence perpetrated by the state. Racial violence has been rationalized, legitimized, and channeled through our criminal justice system as it is expressed by police brutality, solitary confinement, and the discriminatory and arbitrary imposition of the death penalty. Even granting that some African Americans may fear the police today as much as their grandparents feared the Klan, as a wallet can be mistaken for a gun, and that the penal system may be as brutal in many respects as Jim Crow or slavery, the absence of racial hostility in the public discourse and the steep decline in vigilante racial violence are no small matter. It is also significant that the whites-only signs are gone, and that the children of all colors can drink from the same water fountains, swim in the same pools, and play on the same playgrounds. Black children today can even dream of being president of the United States. Those who claim that mass incarceration is just like Jim Crow make a serious mistake. Things have changed. The fact that a clear majority of Americans were telling pollsters in the early 1980s, when the drug war was kicking off, that they opposed race discrimination in nearly all its forms should not be dismissed lightly. Arguably, some respondents may have been telling pollsters what they thought was appropriate rather than what they actually believed, but there's no reason to believe that most of them are lying. It is more likely that most Americans by the early 1980s had come to reject segregationist thinking and values, and not only did not want to be thought of as racist, but did not want to be racist. This different public attitudes has important implications for reform efforts. Claims that mass incarceration is analogous to Jim Crow will fall on deaf ears and alienate potential allies if advocates fail to make clear that the claim is not meant to suggest or imply that supporters of the current system are racist in the way Americans have come to understand that term. Race plays a major role, indeed, a defining role, in the current system, but not because of what is commonly understood as old-fashioned, hostile bigotry. This system of control depends far more on racial indifference, defined as a lack of compassion and caring about the race and people belonging to certain racial groups, rather than racial hostility, a feature that it actually shares with its predecessors. I'm going to open a cough drop. All racial caste systems, not just mass incarceration, have been supported by racial indifference. As noted earlier, many whites during the Jim Crow era sincerely believed that African Americans were inferior, and that segregation was a sensible system for managing a society comprised of fundamentally different and unequal people. The sincerity of many people's bigoted racial beliefs is what led Martin Luther King Jr. to declare, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Good cough drop. Too much saliva. The notion that the racial caste systems are necessarily predicated on a desire to harm other racial groups, and that racial hostility is the essence of racism, is fundamentally misguided. Even slavery does not conform to this limited understanding of racism and racial caste. Not all plantation owners supported the institution of slavery because of a sadistic desire to harm blacks. Most wanted to get rich, and black slavery was the most efficient means to the end. Every plantation owner, however, was willing to use brutality and violence to force black people into servitude, and every American, whether they lived in the North or South, knew that slavery could not be maintained without terror and the deliberate infliction of pain and suffering. The institution of slavery did not require plantation owners or countless bystanders to be filled with racial hostility, so long as plantation owners and a critical mass of American whites remained indifferent to the suffering inflicted upon black slaves. Indeed, it lasted for centuries. Preoccupation with the role of racial hostility in earlier caste systems can blind us in the ways in which every caste system, including mass incarceration, has been supported by racial indifference, a lack of care and compassion for people of other races. Racial animus is a predictable and recurring feature of racial caste systems, but is not necessary for the system to function if there's widespread racial indifference. White victims of racial caste. We now turn to another important difference between mass incarceration and Jim Crow, the direct harm to whites caused by the current caste system. Whites never had to sit at the back of the bus during Jim Crow, but today a white man may find himself in prison for a drug offense, sharing a cell with a black man. The direct harm caused to whites caused by mass incarceration seems to distinguish it from Jim Crow, yet like many other differences, this one requires some qualification. Some whites were directly harmed by Jim Crow. For example, a white woman who fell in love with a black man and hoped to spend the rest of her life with him was directly harmed by anti-miscegenation. Oh Lord. Miscegenation? I'm sorry, I don't know how to say that word. Laws. The laws were indeed for her benefit to protect her from the corrupting influence of the black man and the tragedy of mulatto children, but she was directly harmed nonetheless. Still, it seems obvious that mass incarceration directly harms far more whites than Jim Crow ever did. For some, this fact alone may be reason enough to reject the analogy. An interracial racial caste system may seem like an oxymoron. What kind of racial caste system includes white people within its control? The answer, a racial caste system in the age of colorblindness. If 100% of the people arrested and convicted for drug offenses were African American, the situation would provoke outrage among the majority of Americans. I don't know if y'all can hear that, but it's loud. I'm going to start that paragraph over. If 100% of the people arrested and convicted for drug offenses were African American, the situation would provoke outrage among the majority of Americans who consider themselves non-racist and who know very well that Latinos, Asian Americans, and whites also commit drug crimes. We as a nation seem comfortable with 90% of the people arrested and convicted of drug offenses in the same states being African American, but if the figure were 100%, the veil of colorblindness would be lost. We can no longer tell ourselves a story about why 90% might be a reasonable figure, nor could we continue to assume that good reasons exist for extreme racial disparities in the drug war, even if we are unable to think of such reasons ourselves. In short, the inclusion of some whites in the system of control is essential to preserving the image of a colorblind criminal justice system and maintaining our self-image as fair and unbiased people. Because most Americans, including those within law enforcement, want to believe they are non-racist, the suffering in the drug war crosses the color line. Of course, the fact that white people are harmed by the drug war does not mean that they are the real targets, the designated enemy. The harm white people suffer in the drug war is much like the harm Iraqi civilians suffer in U.S. military actions targeting presumed terrorists or insurgents. In any war, a tremendous amount of collateral damage is inevitable. Black and brown people are the principal targets in this war. White people are collateral damage. Saying that white people are collateral damage may sound callous, but it reflects a particular reality. Mass incarceration, as we know it, would not exist today but for the racialization of crime in the media and political discourse. The war on drugs was declared as part of a political ploy to capitalize on white racial resentment against African Americans, and the Reagan administration used the emergence of crack and its related violence as an opportunity to build a racialized public consensus in support of an all-out war, a consensus that almost certainly would not have been formed if the primary users and dealers of crack had been white. Sorry. Economist Glenn Loury made this observation in the book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. He noted that it is nearly impossible to imagine anything remotely similar to mass incarceration happening to young white men. Can we envision a system that would enforce drug laws almost exclusively among young white men and largely ignore drug crimes among young black men? Can we imagine large minorities of young white men being rounded up for minor drug offenses, placed under the control of criminal justice system, labeled as felons, and then subjected to a lifetime of discrimination, scorn, and exclusion? Can we imagine this happening while most black men landed decent jobs or trotted off to college? No, we can't. If such a thing occurred, it would occasion a most profound reflection about what had gone wrong, not only with them, but with us. It would never be dismissed with the thought that white men were simply reaping what they have sown. The criminalization of white men would disturb us to the core. So the critical questions are: what disturbs us? What is dissonant? What seems anomalous? What is contrary to expectation? Or more to the point, whom do we care about? An answer to the last question may be found by considering the drastically different manner in which we as a nation responded to drunk driving in the mid-1980s as compared to crack cocaine. During the 1980s, at the same time crack was making headlines, a broad-based grassroots movement was underway to address the widespread and sometimes fatal problem of drunk driving. Unlike the drug war, which was initiated by political elites long before ordinary people identified it as an issue of extraordinary concern, the movement to crack down on drunk drivers was a bottom-up movement, led most notably by mothers whose families were shattered by death caused by drunk driving. Media coverage of the movement peaked in 1988 when a drunk driver traveling the wrong way on Interstate 71 in Kentucky caused a head-on collision with a school bus. 27 people died and dozens more were injured in the ensuing fire. The tragic accident, known as the Carrollton Bus Disaster, was one of the worst in U.S. history. In the aftermath, several parents of the victims became actively involved in Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD, and one became its national president. Throughout the 1980s, drunk driving was a regular topic in the media, and the term designated driver became a part of the American lexicon. At the close of the decade, drunk drivers were responsible for approximately 22,000 deaths annually, while overall alcohol-related deaths were close to 100,000 a year. By contrast, during the same time period, there were no prevalent statistics at all on crack, much less crack-related deaths. In fact, the number of deaths related to all illegal drugs combined was tiny compared to the number of deaths caused by drunk drivers. The total of all drug-related deaths due to AIDS, drug overdose, or the violence associated with the illegal drug trade was estimated at 21,000 annually, less than the number of deaths directly caused by drunk drivers, and a small fraction of the number of alcohol-related deaths that occur every year. In response to growing concern, fueled by advocacy groups such as MAD, and by the media coverage of drunk driving fatalities, most states adopted tougher laws to punish drunk driving. Numerous states now have some type of mandatory sentencing for this offense, typically 2 days in jail for a first offense, 2 to 10 days for a second offense. Possession of a tiny amount of crack cocaine, on the other hand, carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. The vastly different sentences afforded drunk drivers and people convicted of drug offenses speaks volumes regarding who is viewed as disposable, someone to be purged from the body politic, and who is not. Drunk drivers are predominantly white and male. White men comprised 78% of the arrests for this offense in 1990, when new mandatory minimums governing drunk driving were being adopted. They are generally charged with misdemeanors and typically receive sentences involving fines, license suspension, and community service. Although drunk driving carries a far greater risk of violent death than the use or sale of illegal drugs, the societal response to drunk drivers has generally emphasized keeping the person functional and in society while attempting to respond to the dangerous behaviors through treatment and counseling. People charged with drug offenses, though, are disproportionately poor people of color. They are typically charged with felonies and sentenced to prison. Another clue that mass incarceration, as we know it, would not exist but for the race of imagined enemy can be found in the history of drug law enforcement in the United States. Yale historian David Musto and other scholars had documented a disturbing, though unsurprising, pattern. Punishment becomes more severe when drug use associated with people of color, but softens when it's associated with whites. The history of marijuana policy is a good example. In the early 1900s, marijuana was perceived, rightly or wrongly, as a drug used by blacks and Mexican Americans, leading to the Boggs Act of 1950s, penalizing first-time possession of marijuana with a sentence of 2 to 5 years in prison. In the 1960s, though, when marijuana became associated with white middle class, and college kids, commissions were promptly created to study whether marijuana was really as harmful as once thought. By 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act differentiated marijuana from other narcotics and lowered federal penalties. The same drug that had been considered fearsome 20 years earlier when associated The same drug that had been considered fearsome 20 years earlier when associated with African Americans and Latinos was refashioned as a relatively harmless drug when associated with whites. In view of the nation's treatment of predominantly white drunk drivers and drug users and dealers, it's extremely difficult to imagine that our nation would have declared all-out war on drugs if the enemy had been defined in the public imagination as white. It was the conflation of blackness and crime in the media and political discourse that made the drug war and the sudden massive expansion of our prison system possible. White drug criminals are collateral damage in the war on drugs because they have been harmed by a war declared with blacks in mind. While the circumstance is horribly unfortunate for them, it does create important opportunities for a multiracial, bottom-up resistance movement, one in which people of all races can claim a clear stake. For the first time in our nation's history, it may become readily apparent to whites how they, too, can be harmed by anti-black racism, a fact that, until now, has been difficult for many to grasp. Black support for Get Tough policies. Yet another notable difference between Jim Crow and mass incarceration is that many African Americans seem to support this current system of control, while most believe the same could not be said of Jim Crow. It is frequently argued in defense of mass incarceration that African Americans want more police and more prisons because crime is so bad in some ghetto communities. It is wrong, these defenders claim, for the tactics of mass incarceration, such as the concentration of law enforcement in poor communities of color, the stop and frisk programs that have proliferated nationwide, evictions of people and their families from public housing, and the drug sweeps of ghetto neighborhoods, to be characterized as racially discriminatory because those programs and policies had been adopted for the benefit of African American communities and are supported by many ghetto residents. Ignoring rampant crime in ghetto communities would be racially discriminatory, they say. Responding forcefully to it is not. This argument, on the surface, seems relatively straightforward, but there are actually many layers to it, some of which are quite problematic. To begin with, the argument implies that most African Americans prefer harsh criminal justice policies to other forms of governmental intervention, such as job creation, economic development, educational reform, and restorative justice programs, as long-term solutions to problems associated with crime. There is little evidence to support that claim. In fact, surveys consistently show that African Americans are generally less supportive of harsh criminal justice policies than whites, even though blacks are far more likely to be victims of crime. This pattern is particularly striking when given that less educated people tend to be more punitive, and blacks on average are less educated than whites. The notion that African Americans support get tough approaches to crime is further complicated by the fact that crime is not a generic category. There are many different types of crime, and violent crime tends to provoke the most visceral and punitive response. Yet, as we have seen in Chapter 2, the drug war has not been aimed at rooting out the most violent drug traffickers or so-called kingpins. The vast majority of those arrested for drug crimes are not charged with serious offenses, and most of the people in state prisons on drug charges have no history of violence or significant selling activity. Those who are kingpins are often able to buy their freedom by forfeiting their assets, snitching on other dealers, or becoming paid government informants. Thus, to the extent that some African Americans support harsh policies aimed at people who commit violent crimes, they cannot be said to support the war on drugs, which has been waged primarily against people who have allegedly committed nonviolent, low-level drug crimes in communities of color. The one thing that is clear from the survey data and ethnographic research is that African Americans in ghetto communities experience an intense dual frustration regarding crime and law enforcement. As Glenn Laurie explained more than a decade ago, when violent crime rates were making headlines, the young black men wreaking havoc in the ghettos are still our youngsters in the eyes of many of the decent poor and working class black people who sometimes are the victims. Throughout the black community, there is a widespread awareness that black ghetto youth have few, if any, realistic options, and therefore dealing drugs can be an irresistible temptation. Suburban white youth may deal drugs to their friends and acquaintances as a form of recreation and extra cash, but for impoverished black youth, drug sales, though rarely lucrative, are often a means of survival, a means of helping to feed and clothe themselves and their families. The fact that this career path leads almost inevitably to jail is often understood as an unfortunate fact of life, part of what it means to be poor and black in America. Women, in particular, express complicated, conflicted views about crime because they love their sons, husbands, and partners and understand their plight as current and future members of the racial undercast. At the same time, though, they abhor gangs and the violence associated with inner-city life. One commentator explained, African American women in poor neighborhoods are torn. They worry about their young sons getting involved in gang activity. They worry about their sons possibly selling or using drugs. They worry about their children getting caught in the crossfire of warring gangs. The mothers want better crime and law enforcement. Yet they understand that the increased levels of law enforcement potentially saddle their children with a felony conviction, a mark that can ensure economic and social marginalization. Given the dilemma facing poor black communities, it is inaccurate to say that black people support mass incarceration or get tough policies. The fact that some black people endorse harsh responses to crime is best understood as a form of complicity with mass incarceration, not support for it. This complicity is perfectly understandable, for the threat posed by crime, particularly violent crime, is real, not imagined. Although African Americans do not engage in drug crime at significantly higher rates than white, black men do have much higher rates of violent crime, and violent crime is concentrated in ghetto communities. Studies have shown that joblessness, not race or black culture, explain the high rates of violent crimes in black communities. When researchers have controlled for joblessness, differences in violent crime rates between young black and white men disappear. Regardless, the reality for poor blacks trapped in ghettos remains the same. They must live in a state of perpetual insecurity and fear. It is perfectly understandable, then, that some African Americans would be complicit with the system of mass incarceration, even if they oppose, as a matter of social policy, the creation of racially isolated ghettos and the subsequent transfer of black youth from underfunded, crumbling schools to brand new high-tech prisons. In the era of mass incarceration, poor African Americans are not given the option of great schools, community investment, or job training. Instead, they are offered police and prisons. It's the only choice that is offered. If the only choice that is offered blacks is rampant crime or more prisons, the predictable and understandable answer will be more prisons. The predicament African Americans find themselves in today is not altogether different from the situation they faced during Jim Crow. Jim Crow, as oppressive as it was, offered a measure of security for blacks who were willing to play by its rules. Those who flouted the rules or resisted them risked the terror of the Klan. Cooperation with the Jim Crow system often seemed far more likely to increase or maintain one's security than any alternative. That reality helps to explain why African American leaders such as Booker T. Washington urged blacks to focus on improving themselves rather than challenging racial discrimination. It is also why the Civil Rights Movement initially met significant resistance among some African Americans in the South. Civil rights advocates strenuously argued that it was the mentality and ideology that gave rise to Jim Crow that was the real source of the danger experienced by blacks. Of course, they were right, but it is understandable why some blacks believed their immediate safety and security could best be protected by cooperation with the prevailing caste system. The fact that black people during Jim Crow were often complicit with the system of control did not mean they supported racial oppression. Disagreements within the African American community about how best to respond to systems of control, and even disagreements about what is and is not discriminatory, have a long history. The notion that black people have always been united in opposition to the American caste system is sheer myth. Following slavery, for example, there were some African Americans who supported disenfranchisement because they believed that black people were not yet ready for the vote. Former slaves, it was argued, were too illiterate to exercise the vote responsibly and were ill prepared for the duties of public office. This sentiment could even be found among black politicians such as Isaiah T. Montgomery, who argued in 1890 that voting rights should be denied to black people because enfranchisement should only be extended to literate men. In the same vein, a fierce debate raged between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois about whether and to what extent racial bias and discrimination were responsible for the plight of the Negro and ought to be challenged. Du Bois praised and embraced Washington's emphasis on thrift, patience, and industrial training for the masses, but sharply disagreed with his public acceptance of segregation, disenfranchisement, and legal discrimination. In Du Bois's view, Washington's public statements arguing that poor education and bad choices were responsible for the plight of former slaves ignored the damage wrought by caste and threatened to rationalize the entire system. In Du Bois's words, "The distinct impression left by Mr. Washington's propaganda is, first, that the South is justified in its present attitude toward the Negro because of the Negro's degradation. Second, that the prime cause of the Negro's failure to rise more quickly is his wrong education in the past. And thirdly, that his future rise depends primarily on his own efforts. Each of these propositions is a dangerous half-truth. Washington's doctrine has tended to make the whites, North and South, shift the burden of the Negro problem to the Negro's shoulders and stand aside as critical and rather pessimistic spectators, when in fact the burden belongs to the nation, and the hands of none of us are clean if we bend not our energies to righting these great wrongs." Today, a similar debate rages in black communities about the underlying causes of mass incarceration. While some argue that it is attributable primarily to racial bias and discrimination, others maintain that it is due to poor education, unraveling morals, and a lack of thrift and perseverance among the urban poor. Just as former slaves were viewed, even among some African Americans, as unworthy of full citizenship due to their lack of education and good morals, today similar arguments can be heard from black people across the political spectrum who believe that reform efforts should be focused on moral uplift and education for ghetto dwellers rather than challenging the system of mass incarceration itself. Scholars, activists, and community members who argue that moral uplift and education provide the best solution to black criminality and the phenomenon of mass incarceration have been influenced by what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham has called the politics of respectability, a politics that was born in the 19th century and matured in the Jim Crow era. This political strategy is predicated on the notion that the goal of racial equality can only be obtained if black people are able to successfully prove to whites that they are worthy of equal treatment, dignity, and respect. Supporters of the politics of respectability believe that African Americans, if they hope to be accepted by whites, must conduct themselves in a fashion that elicits respect and sympathy rather than fear and anger from other races. They must demonstrate, through words and deeds, their ability to live by and aspire to the same moral codes as white middle class, even while they are being discriminated against wrongly. The basic theory underlying this strategy is that white Americans will abandon discriminatory practices if and when it becomes apparent that black people aren't inferior after all. The politics of respectability made sense to many black reformers during the Jim Crow era, since African Americans had no vote, could not change policy, and lived under the constant threat of the Klan. Back then, the only thing black people could control was their own behavior. Many believed they simply had no choice, no realistic option, but to cooperate with the caste system while conducting themselves in such a dignified and respectable manner that it would eventually become obvious to whites that their bigotry was misplaced. This strategy worked to some extent for a segment of the African American community, particularly those who had access to education and relative privilege. But a much larger segment, those who were uneducated and desperately poor, found themselves unable, as one historian put it, to conform to the gender roles, public behavior, and economic activity deemed legitimate by bourgeois America, but which the forces of Jim Crow sought to prevent black people from achieving. In many cases, the relatively privileged black elite turned against the black urban poor, condemning them and distancing themselves, while at the same time presenting themselves as legitimate spokespeople for the disadvantaged. As a pattern that would repeat itself in cities throughout the United States, as black communities found themselves embroiled in deep conflict over goals and strategies pursued by black elite. What happened in Atlanta in the wake of the New Deal is the case in point. During Jim Crow, all black people in Atlanta were bound together by the racial caste system, but there was a significant group of African Americans who were well educated and had influence in the halls of power. Numerous black colleges were located in Atlanta, and the city was home to the South's largest population of college-educated African Americans. Members of this relatively elite group believed they could prove their respectability to white Americans and often blamed less educated blacks for sabotaging their quest for racial equality, especially when they committed crimes or failed to conform to white, middle-class norms of dress, cleanliness, and behavior. In the view of these black elites, a poverty complex plagued the black poor, one that made them politically apathetic and content with broken down, overcrowded, and dirty living conditions. For decades, black elites engaged in private rescue efforts to make black communities tidy, clean, and respectable in a futile effort to gain white approval. Eventually, one of these rescue efforts gave way to black endorsement of harmful policies aimed at the urban poor. In the 1930s and early 1940s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt began to roll out the New Deal, a massive public works and investment program designed to lift the nation out of severe depression. Almost immediately, black elites recognized the opportunity for the individual and collective advancement of Negroes who could present themselves as favorably to whites. Some black Atlantans were brought from the margins into the sphere of opportunity by the New Deal programs, but most were left behind. As historian Karen Ferguson observes, when black reformers had the opportunity to determine the recipients of the New Deal largesse, they did not choose the mudsills of the black working class, but rather the more prosperous elements who were more able to be respectable according to the reformers' vision. Far from prioritizing the needs of the least advantaged, many black reformers began aggressively pursuing policy reforms that would benefit the black elite to the detriment of the poorest segments of the black community. Some of the most discriminatory federal programs of the New Deal era, including the Slum Clearance Program, received strong support from African American bureaucrats and reformers who presented themselves as speaking for the black community as a whole. Although many poor African Americans rejected the philosophies, tactics, and strategies of the black elite, ultimately moral uplift ideology became the new common sense. Not just in Atlanta, but in cities nationwide, the tensions and debates between black reformers struggling to improve and uplift the slum dwellers and those committed to challenging discrimination and Jim Crow directly played out over and over again. Black elites found that they had much to gain by positioning themselves as race managers, and many poor African Americans became persuaded that perhaps their degraded status was, after all, their own fault. Given this history, it should come as no surprise that today some black mayors, politicians, and lobbyists, as well as preachers, teachers, barbers, and ordinary folk, endorse get-tough tactics and spend more time chastising the urban poor for their behavior than seeking meaningful policy solutions to the appalling conditions in which they are forced to live and raise their children. The fact that many African Americans endorse aspects of the current caste system and insist that problems of the urban poor can be explained by their behavior, culture, and attitude does not in any meaningful way distinguish mass incarceration from its predecessors. To the contrary, these attitudes and arguments have their roots in the struggle to end slavery and Jim Crow. Many African Americans today believe that uplift ideology worked in the past and ought to work again, forgetting that ultimately it took a major movement to end the last caste system, not simply good behavior. Many black people are confused, and the black community itself is divided, about how best to understand and respond to mass incarceration. A seemingly colorblind system has emerged that locks millions of African Americans into a permanent undercaste, and it appears that those who are trapped within it could have avoided it simply by not committing crimes. Isn't the answer not to challenge the system but to try and avoid it? Shouldn't the focus be on improving ourselves rather than challenging a biased system? Familiar questions are asked decades after the end of old Jim Crow. Once again, complicity in the prevailing system of control may seem like the only option. Parents and school teachers counsel black children that if they ever hope to escape the system and avoid prison time, they must be on their best behavior, raise their arms and spread their legs for the police without complaint, stay in failing schools, pull up their pants, and refuse all forms of illegal work and money-making activity, even if jobs in the legal economy are impossible to find. Girls are told not to have children until they're married to a good black man who can help provide for a family with a legal job. They're told to wait and wait for Mr. Right, even if that means, in a jobless ghetto, never having children at all. When black youth find it difficult or impossible to live up to these standards, or when they fail, stumble, and make mistakes, as all humans do, shame and blame is often heaped upon them. If only they had made different choices. They're told sternly they wouldn't be sitting in a jail cell. They'd be graduating from college. Never mind that white children on the other side of town who made precisely the same choices, often for less compelling reasons, are in fact going to college. The genius of the current caste system, and what most distinguishes it from its predecessors, is that it appears voluntary. People choose to commit crimes, and that's why they're locked up or locked out, we are told. This feature makes the politics of responsibility particularly tempting, as it appears the system can be avoided with good behavior. But herein lies the trap. All people make mistakes. All of us are sinners. All of us are criminals. All of us violate the law at some point in our lives. In fact, if the worst thing you have ever done is sped 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you have put yourself and others at more risk and harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of his or her living room. Yet there are people in the United States serving life sentences for first-time drug offenses, something virtually unheard of anywhere else in the world. The notion that a vast gulf exists between criminals and those of us who have never served time in prison is a fiction created by the racial ideology that birthed mass incarceration, namely that there is something fundamentally wrong and morally inferior about them. The reality, though, is that all of us have done wrong. As noted earlier, studies suggest that most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Indeed, most of us break the law, not once, but repeatedly throughout our lives. Yet only some of us will be arrested, charged, convicted of a crime, branded a criminal or felon, and ushered into a permanent undercaste. Who becomes a social pariah and excommunicated from the civil society and who trots off to college bears scant relationship to the morality of crimes committed. Who is more blameworthy, the young black kid who hustles on the street corner selling weed to help his mama pay the rent, or the college kid who deals drugs out of his dorm room so that he'll have cash to finance his spring break? Who should we fear? The kid in the hood who joined a gang and now carries a gun for security because his neighborhood is frightening and unsafe? Or the suburban high school student who has a drinking problem but keeps getting behind the wheel? Our racially biased system of mass incarceration exploits the fact that all people break the law and make mistakes at various points in their lives and with varying degrees of justification. Screwing up, failing to live by one's highest ideals and values, is part of what makes us human. Urging the urban poor, or anyone, to live up to their highest ideals and values is a good thing, as it demonstrates confidence in the ability of all people to stretch, grow, and evolve. Even in the most dire circumstances, we all have power and agency, the ability to choose what we think and how we respond to the circumstances of our lives. Moreover, we all have duties and responsibilities to each other, not the least of which is to do no harm. We ought never excuse violence or tolerate behavior that jeopardizes the safety and security of others. just as all people, no matter who they are or what they have done, ought to be regarded as having basic human rights to work, housing, education, and food, residents of all communities have the basic right to safety and security. The intuition underlying moral uplift strategies is fundamentally sound. Our communities will never thrive if we fail to respect ourselves and one another. As a liberation strategy, however, the politics of responsibility is doomed to fail. Not because there is something especially wrong with those locked in ghettos or prisons today, but because there is nothing special about them. They are merely human. They will continue to make mistakes and break the law for reasons that may or may not be justified. And as long as they do so, the system of mass incarceration will continue to function well. Generations of black men will continue to be lost, rounded up for crimes that go ignored on the other side of town, and ushered into a permanent second-class status. It may seem at first blush that cooperating with the system while urging good behavior is the only option available, but in reality it is not a liberation strategy at all. I'm gonna pause here.
Yes.
I'm right there at Fork in the Road.
Fork in the road. Oh, that's funny.
Oh, I'm so connected.
Okay, so we're gonna play a speech for a moment here, and then we'll get back to the book. All right. Man, we need a mute button so we don't got a hot mic. Oh, I can turn the volume down. I want to talk freely. Okay, we're just going to take a small moment, then we'll return with reading the book, okay? Don't stop talking. Oh, the mic was still on, wasn't it? It was a hot mic. Oh, man. It's just like when Jesse Jackson said he's going to cut off